They said we couldn't feed a community of 40 through winter without a grocery store. We proved them wrong. But here's what nobody talks about. It wasn't the garden that saved us. It wasn't the preserving, the canning, or the freezing. It was something we discovered halfway through October that completely changed how we think about food security on a homestead, and I'm going to walk you through exactly what that was. Because by the end of this video, you'll understand why most people fail at winter food independence, and more importantly, how to avoid that trap entirely. If you're building a homestead, growing food, or even just trying to reduce your trips to the store, you need to see what we learned. So hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me, what's the one food you absolutely cannot imagine living without? Because that answer is going to tell you exactly where you're most vulnerable this winter. Wait, this part is important. Everything I'm about to show you is explained in much greater detail in our complete guide on winter food independence. It's available in the description and pinned in the comments. That guide walks you through the psychological and logistical systems that actually work, not just the romantic idea of homesteading. It's where we break down the real numbers, the failures, and the exact turning point where everything shifted for us. Now, let me back up. 3 years ago, our community made a bold decision. We were tired of depending on trucks, on supply chains, on the assumption that food would always be available whenever we needed it. 40 families, about 240 people total, committed to feeding ourselves through a full winter using only what we could grow, preserve, and store ourselves. Sounds romantic, right? And the first year we thought so too. We planted aggressively. We tilled up every available inch. We imagined ourselves in October, surrounded by abundance, feeling secure and self-sufficient. The whole community was excited. Some of the older folks, people who had grown up doing this, they just smiled and nodded when we told them our plans. Looking back, I understand that smile now. We weren't wrong about the food production. By late August, we had plenty, more than we'd ever had. The canning operation was running constantly. It was beautiful and exhausting. Families were working 10 hours a day. We had tomatoes, beans, squash, cucumbers, herbs, berries. We pickled things. We dried things. We filled hundreds of jars, and we felt invincible. By November, we were a different story. The problem wasn't that we ran out of food. We didn't. But around mid-November, something shifted psychologically in the community. People started getting anxious. The abundance of summer felt like a distant memory. We were eating the same preserved foods, day after day. Potatoes and carrots were holding up fine, but the variety was shrinking. People felt trapped by their own plan. And that's when one of the elders in our community, a woman named Martha who'd been through this cycle before, she pulled me aside and said something that changed everything. She said, "You didn't fail at preserving enough food. You failed at understanding what people actually eat." And then she walked me through her root cellar, and it looked nothing like ours. The revelation wasn't about having more food. It was about having the right distribution of different types of food. And that distribution had to match three things: what people would actually eat repeatedly without getting sick of it, what would physically last through the entire winter without spoiling, and what combination would keep people psychologically stable, not bored, not anxious, but calm and confident. We had made a critical mistake. We'd optimized for maximum preservation. We'd preserved everything we could because we were afraid of running out. But what we actually needed was a completely different inventory, one built around what people would eat, the psychology of food variety, and the reality of winter appetite. And this is the moment. This is where it gets specific and where most homesteaders go wrong. And it's in the guide. The guide lays out the exact formula we discovered. Not just the food types, but the ratios. How much grain versus how much preserved vegetables? How much dairy product versus meat? How much fresh root vegetable storage versus canned goods? Because when you get these ratios right, something magical happens. People stop obsessing about food. They stop counting jars. They stop feeling afraid. For us, that shift happened in early December. Once Martha shared her system and we reorganized everything, the anxiety just lifted. It wasn't because we suddenly had more food. We had the same food, but we understood it differently. We knew what we had, we knew how long it would last, and we knew that the variety was deliberate enough to keep people satisfied. That was 3 winters ago. Since then, we've refined the system every year. And what's remarkable is that the amount of work hasn't increased. We're not preserving more. We're not growing more aggressively. We're just being smarter about what we preserve and how we organize what we have. But here's what I want to emphasize, and this is crucial. Our community isn't special. We don't have some secret knowledge that nobody else has. We're not farming on better land. We're not wealthier. We didn't have some head start that other communities don't have access to. What we did have was the willingness to fail, adjust, and listen to people who had actually done this before. And the moment we stopped trying to be heroes and started asking the right questions, what will people actually eat instead of how much can we preserve? Everything changed. The food didn't change. Our psychology did. And I think that's the piece that nobody talks about in homesteading. Everyone focuses on the technical skill, how to can, how to preserve, how to grow. But the real skill is understanding human psychology and human appetite, especially when people are confined indoors for months, eating the same basic ingredients, without the emotional release of shopping or variety. This is actually where the guide becomes essential. Because the psychology piece, the menu planning, the ingredient distribution, the way to structure your storage so that people see variety even when the raw materials are limited, that's the difference between a successful winter food operation and a community falling apart from anxiety and boredom. Before we go deeper into how this actually works on a daily basis, I need to tell you something that's going to affect how you approach the next section of this video. The thing that separates communities that make it through winter intact from those that don't isn't just having enough food. It's having a system that lets people actually feel secure while they're eating it. And here's where most people fail. They store food in bulk, which is smart, but they hide it away. They put it in a cold basement corner, or in bins they never open, and then when someone in the family or community feels anxious about supplies, there's no visual reassurance. The mind doesn't trust what it can't see. The Amish families I've spent time with, they do this differently. Their storage isn't hidden. It's integrated into the living space in a way that's beautiful and functional. You walk past it regularly. You see abundance. You see it reflected back at you every single day. And that visual anchor is what keeps panic at bay when the snow is 3 feet high and the world outside feels impossibly distant. I've seen families fail at this, and it wasn't because they lacked food. It was because they lacked visibility, lacked that psychological anchor. And when you're feeding 40 people through 4 months of winter, psychology becomes logistics. It becomes a survival variable. Now, before we continue, and this matters, keep this close to your mind for a moment. What I'm about to show you next is the actual rotation system, the inventory tracking, the preservation calendar that makes this all work without anyone going hungry and without food spoiling in the process. But the deeper mechanics, the psychology, the family meetings around winter food, the way to actually communicate about scarcity without triggering fear, the seasonal planning that starts in spring, all of that is what I've documented in the complete guide. The link is in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. This guide goes far beyond just the basics. It covers the mental framework, the community rituals, the preparation timeline, and the troubleshooting that happens when things don't go as planned. It's the resource that ties all of this together. So let's get into how the rotation actually works in practice, because this is where theory becomes reality. In a community of 40 people, you're not just managing 40 individual diets. You're managing a collective caloric need that changes seasonally, and you're managing it with precision because there's no room for error or waste. The families I worked with use what they call a tier system. Tier 1 is your immediate consumption. Fresh, preserved goods, things that were put up recently and have the shortest shelf life. These are what get eaten first. Tier 2 is your core storage, your main staples, grains, dried goods, canned vegetables. These are your backbone. They're stable, they last, and they form the basis of 90% of your meals. And Tier 3, that's your emergency buffer. The things you hope you never touch. Root crops stored in sand, frozen goods, preserved meats. This is your insurance policy. This is what you reach for if the first 2 tiers are exhausted or if there's an unexpected crisis. Illness, injury, family arriving unexpectedly. The rotation works because of discipline and visibility. Every week, not once a month, once a year, but every week, one person is assigned to audit the first tier, to see what's been used, what's running low, what needs to be rotated up from Tier 2. And every 2 weeks, they review Tier 2 against the meal plan for the next month. This isn't busy work. This is the difference between feeding 40 people successfully and having a month where rationing kicks in because no one tracked what was actually being used. I watched a community of 35 people plan an entire winter menu on a single afternoon in late September. They sat around a long table with pencils, paper, and a list of everything they had preserved that year. And they didn't just plan it casually, they cross-referenced. They calculated, they made sure that no single tier would be depleted before the next one was supposed to activate. And what struck me most was the conversation underneath the logistics. They were asking each other questions like, do we have enough variety for Sarah's family? She has 4 growing boys. Or, last year we ran short on pickle jars by February. Did we account for that? Or, if we lose access to fresh milk by December, how does that change our cheese and butter projections? They weren't just asking, do we have enough? They were asking, will people feel like we have enough? Will there be morale on February 15th? This is the invisible infrastructure of winter food security. It's not just about calories or nutrients. It's about managing expectation, managing morale, managing the psychology of scarcity. And once the system is locked in, once everyone knows their role and trusts the plan, something remarkable happens. The community actually relaxes. The anxiety drops. People stop hoarding in secret. They stop worrying. They know the system will hold. I've seen families enter winter with the same amount of food, but completely different outcomes. One thriving, one struggling. And the difference came down to whether people believed the plan was solid, whether they trusted it would hold until spring. This trust doesn't come from a single conversation in September. It comes from track record. It comes from the community having done this before and succeeded. And it comes from transparency, from people being able to see the system working in real time, week after week, month after month. And that brings us to something critical that most homesteaders and small communities overlook entirely. They focus on the storage and the rotation, but they miss the communication piece. Because feeding a community through winter isn't a one-person job, and the moment you try to make it one, you've already failed. The rotation system only works if multiple people understand it, own pieces of it, and can execute it without the original planner having to micromanage. You need someone to audit weekly. You need someone else to manage the meal plan rotation, someone else to handle preservation, someone to communicate with families about what's available. And when I say communicate, I don't mean sending an email. In the communities I visited, they have weekly kitchen meetings, sometimes twice weekly, 15 minutes, maybe 20. Everyone involved in food preparation, storage, or consumption sits down and they talk about what's working, what isn't, what they've noticed, what they're concerned about. One woman mentioned that her family was getting tired of the preserved vegetable mix they'd used in one batch. Nothing was wrong with the vegetables, they were fine. It's just, after eating the same combination 5 times in 3 weeks, people wanted something different. So the next week, the community rotated to a different preserved batch that had different vegetables in it. It cost nothing. It didn't change the nutrition, but it changed the mood. That's the kind of detail that only surfaces when you have the communication structure in place to hear it. This is where I want to pause and make sure something is crystal clear to you. The mechanics of winter food security, the rotation, the inventory, the menu planning, the communication, they're all learnable. Any homesteader can do this. Any small community can do this. But the mindset behind it, the philosophy that says, we will plan together, we will execute together, we will trust together, that's the foundation that has to exist first. Everything else, all the jars and the dates and the rotation schedules, that flows out of that foundation. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, okay, I understand the system, I understand the mindset, but what about the actual food? What do they actually eat? This is the question that separates theory from reality. Because knowing how to manage the system is one thing, knowing the what to manage is another. And this is where the real genius of their system emerges. They don't store food the way most people think about storage. They don't buy in bulk from a warehouse club and hope it lasts. That's reactive. That's gambling. What they do is something far more intentional. They grow specific crops throughout the year, rotating seasons, rotating varieties, and they process only what they know will be eaten. Sounds simple, right? It's not. Because here's the thing, nobody tells you about feeding 40 people through winter. You can't just store 40 portions of everything. The math doesn't work. You store strategically. You store the foods that give you the highest nutrition to storage ratio. You store the foods that are hardest to replace once the growing season ends. And you store the foods that, frankly, the community actually wants to eat. The grains. That's job number one. Winter or summer, you need grain. Wheat, oats, corn, barley. A community of 40 will go through roughly 300 pounds of grain per month. That's 3,600 pounds for the winter season. And they store it in food-grade buckets with oxygen absorbers in a cool, dark space. Cost? Roughly $60 for the grain itself. A commercial operation would charge you $800. But grain alone doesn't keep people healthy. You need legumes, beans, lentils, split peas. These are the protein backbone. They store indefinitely if kept dry. A single 40-pound bag of dried beans costs $12 and can feed 40 people for 2 weeks of daily meals. Do the math on what a grocery store charges for that same nutrition, and you're looking at $500. Then there are the preserved vegetables: tomatoes, peppers, zucchini, green beans. Everything is canned or fermented. Nothing is frozen, because they're not relying on electricity they don't have year-round. These are the foods that provide micronutrients, fiber, and, honestly, the variety that keeps people from getting sick of eating the same 3 things all winter. And the root vegetables: potatoes, carrots, beets, parsnips. These go into sandboxes in an unheated root cellar where the temperature stays between 35 and 50 degrees. One person is responsible for checking them every 2 weeks, removing any that are starting to spoil. This is not glamorous work, but it's the work that stands between the community eating well and the community eating poorly. Wait, I need to pause here for just a moment, because I want you to understand something crucial that most people miss completely. The system I'm describing to you, this entire approach to feeding a community without a grocery store, it's not actually about food at all. It's about trust. It's about knowing with absolute certainty that the system will hold. And that certainty comes from one single principle. Everything is documented, everything is tracked, and everyone knows the numbers. This is where my complete guide on homestead food security comes in. I've put together a resource that breaks down exactly how to calculate your family's actual caloric and nutritional needs, how to plan a year-round garden that hits those targets, how to process and preserve without fancy equipment, and how to audit your storage twice a year to catch problems before they become crises. You'll find it linked in the description and pinned in the comments. That's where the real foundation building happens. Because here's what I've learned by documenting what this community does. They don't run their food system by guessing. They run it by knowing. Every single person in that community of 40 knows how much food is stored. They know what's expected to last until what date. They know what crops are going in the ground next spring. They know what the rotation is. And they know what happens if someone gets sick and can't work, or if a crop fails, or if the winter is longer than expected. They've built redundancy into the system. Backup stores, backup plans, different preservation methods for the same foods, because if one method fails, another won't. And this is the secret I promised you at the beginning. The one thing that separates communities that successfully feed themselves through winter from those that struggle. It's not the growing skill, it's not the preservation technique, it's not even the amount of land you have. It's the willingness to be systematic about something that most people treat as chaos. It's the decision to track, to document, to audit, and to adjust. It's the understanding that feeding a community, whether that community is 40 people or a family of 4, requires the same discipline you'd apply to running a business. Because, in a real sense, you are running a business. You're just not selling the product. You're consuming it. This is what it looks like when the system works. Not a photograph, not a moment frozen in time, but the actual, ongoing reality of people eating well, together, without depending on a supply chain that could break tomorrow. So here's my challenge for you this week. Pick one category of food that your family eats regularly: grain, or legumes, or vegetables, or something else. Do the math. How much do you actually consume in a month? How much would it cost you to buy a year's supply? And how would you preserve it? Don't build the entire system this week. Just understand one piece of it deeply, because once you understand one piece, the rest becomes possible. If this resonated with you, if you understand now why so many people are looking at their grocery receipts and asking themselves if there's a better way, then I'd love for you to subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a video about building food security and homestead resilience the way our ancestors understood it. And if you have experience with preserving food or feeding your own community, leave a comment below. I read every single one, and I'd love to hear your story. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time. End of part 3/end of script.